What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Straight from the Crates. And let's just get straight to it because this conversation is going to make people uncomfortable, and honestly, it should. There's an idea floating around today that black men and black women are just naturally at odds, like something is inherently broken between us, like we just can't get it right with each other. You see it everywhere: podcasts, YouTube, TikTok, my comment sections, and it feels constant. But what if I told you that the narrative didn't start with us, and more importantly, it didn't benefit us either? When you actually trace this thing back, you start to see a pattern that goes way deeper than dating conversations or social media arguments. You start to see strategy, you start to see conditioning, and whether people want to admit it or not, you start to see how effective it's been. So let's go all the way back because you can't understand where we are without understanding where it was built. So during slavery, black people, we weren't just controlled physically, they were controlling us psychologically. Families were deliberately broken apart. Black men were stripped of their abilities to lead, protect, provide, and not because they were incapable, but because systems were put in place to make sure they couldn't. Black women were forced into roles where they had to survive under constant pressure, violence, and instability. That dynamic alone created an imbalance that didn't just disappear when slavery ended. It planted seeds, and then came the reinforcement through media, starting with minstrel shows. Now, this is where it gets real because minstrel shows weren't just entertainment, they were propaganda disguised as comedy. This is where America was introduced to caricatures that still haunt us today. The black man as a brute, violent, hypersexual, dangerous. The black woman as the mammy, loud, domineering, desexualized, or the Jezebel, oversexualized and manipulative. These weren't random. These were specific characters. They were strategic images used to shape how society viewed black people and eventually how black people viewed themselves and each other. Because if you can convince the world that black men are inherently dangerous, you justify controlling them. If you can convince the world that black women are overly aggressive or only valuable in limited roles, you justify dismissing them. And if you can push these images long enough, they stop being seen as stereotypes and start being accepted as reality. Now sit with that. They started off as stereotypes and it was pushed over and over and over. So this is going on to almost 200 years now, and people are seeing this as reality. So when we keep talking about men and women saying all men, all black women, that is an untrue statement. That is stereotypes and perceptions being morphed into a reality when it is not the reality. So we just fast forward into the 20th century, especially around the civil rights era, and you'd think that the narrative would shift in a positive direction, but instead, the media found a new angle: the news. And the news began to heavily focus on crime in black communities. And let's be clear, crime existed everywhere, but the way it was covered made it seem like blackness itself was synonymous with danger. If you turn on the TV, and what do you see? Mugshots, police chases, poverty, chaos. And who was centered in those images? Black men. So now you have decades of conditioning that says black men are a threat, not just to society, but subtly to their own communities and families. That fear doesn't just stay outside, it seeps inward. Policies follow perception, Mass incarceration explodes. Black men are removed from households at disproportionate rates. And now black women are left to carry everything, raising children alone, trying to hold the family together, navigating systems that weren't built for them to succeed. So, what happens next? The narrative, it evolved again. Now, instead of just demonizing black men, media begins highlighting the dysfunction within black relationships. And we enter the 90s, the talk show era. This is where things get tricky because this is where representation starts to feel like exposure, but it's not balanced. Shows like Jerry Springer, Maury, and yes, even your precious Oprah repeatedly brought on stories that showcase broken relationships, cheating scandals, absent fathers, conflicts between black men and black women. And let's not pretend this didn't have an impact. Just because some of these stories were real, when you consistently platform the most dysfunctional examples of a group, you create a distorted mirror. People start to believe that's the norm. And here's where it gets even more complicated. When those narratives are delivered by someone who looks like you, it hits differently. It feels more credible, even if it's still selective. It's not about blaming one individual. It's about recognizing how systems use familiar faces to package certain messages in ways that are easier to accept. So I'm going to say that again. They're using familiar faces to package messages in ways that's easier for you to accept. That means they're using each other to promote propaganda to destroy ourselves. So now we move into the 2000s and beyond, and instead of things improving, the strategy it adapts because now we're in the age of the internet, social media algorithms. And this is where a lot of people miss what's really happening. The gatekeepers didn't disappear, they just changed the rules. Now the content that creates the most emotional reaction gets pushed the hardest. And what creates more reaction than conflict between black men and black women? You've got entire platforms built on it, clips of arguments, debates about submission and masculinity, conversations about who's failing who's the problem, who's the prize. And here's the part that's uncomfortable but necessary to say: we're participating in it. Not because we're inherently against each other, but because the system rewards that behavior. Division gets views, views gets money, money keeps the cycle going. So now, instead of external forces having to constantly push these narratives, they've created an environment where we amplify them ourselves. We're doing this to ourselves now, and they're still making money off of us. They're still creating division off of us. We're still blaming each other when it's not us. And the more extreme the take, the more it spreads. The more it spreads, and it shapes the perception. And after a while, people start to believe that the loudest voices represent the majority. But the truth is, it's all an illusion. Because in reality, most black men and most black women are not at war with each other. They're building families, they're supporting each other, they're navigating life to the best of their ability. But as we know, stability does not trend, peace does not go viral, so it gets ignored, and dysfunction becomes the main story again. Now, I want to be clear because this isn't about pretending there aren't real issues within the community. There are. There's trauma that's been passed down for generations. There's economic pressure. There's mistrust. There are real conversations that need to happen about accountability on all sides. But there's a difference between addressing problems and feeding narratives that keep us stuck in them. At some point, we have to ask ourselves, are we actually trying to understand each other, or are we performing for an audience that benefits from us staying divided? Because if we step back and look at the full timeline, From slavery to minstrel shows to media coverage to talk shows to social media, you start to see that this isn't random. This method just evolves with time, and the goal stays the same: keep the people divided. And the easier it is to control them, the easier it is to predict and profit from them. And the most dangerous part of all, this isn't the original propaganda. It's when it becomes internalized, when we start speaking about each other using the same language, the same stereotypes, the same assumptions that were created to break us. That's crazy. When the system doesn't even have to work anymore, we do the work for it. That's what we're doing now. We're working for the system. Where does that leave us now? Because it's easy to point out the problem. It's harder to talk about what comes next. Unity does not mean ignoring issues. It doesn't mean pretending everything is perfect or forcing relationships that aren't healthy. But it does mean being intentional about not feeding narratives that paint us as enemies by default. It means recognizing patterns when you see them and questioning why certain types of content are constantly pushed in our faces. It means having real conversations without turning them into performances. And most importantly, it means understanding that just because something is loud, visible, and repeated does not mean it's true, especially for the majority. Because if there's one thing history shows us, it's that perception can be manufactured. And if perception can be controlled, behavior can be influenced. And if behavior can be influenced, outcomes can be shaped. So, no, this just isn't about dating. It's not about who's right or who's wrong in these online debates. It's about recognizing a pattern that's been running for generations and deciding whether we're going to keep playing into it. Because division didn't start with us. But at this point, we have to decide if it's going to end with us. And that's the real conversation people don't want to have. That's all I got for today. Y'all talk to me in the comments. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for chilling with me at Straight from the Crates. And we are going to get back into the music reviews, but we need to talk about this. Peace.